North Carolina's coastline is collapsing into the Atlantic Ocean, and entire neighborhoods are disappearing with it. In just a matter of weeks, multiple homes along North Carolina's Outer Banks collapsed directly into the ocean as the shoreline gave way beneath them. Not during a hurricane, not during a catastrophic storm surge. The land itself simply disappeared. Rodanthe waves are now destroying homes so frequently that locals have watched entire stretches of coastline transform into debris fields of broken wood, twisted foundations, and shattered memories. Scientists say this is no longer a slow-moving environmental problem. It is a structural collapse happening in real time. Coastal erosion is accelerating. Sea level is rising faster here than along much of the East Coast. Storm waves are hitting harder more often, and in places like Rodanthe, the shoreline is retreating so quickly that homes once considered safely inland are now falling into the Atlantic one after another. Some experts no longer talk about stopping the damage. The conversation has shifted to something far more unsettling. How to manage retreat when the land itself is no longer stable enough to defend. Right now, as you watch this video, an entire ocean is eating North Carolina alive. 500 miles of coastline under an invisible countdown that nobody wants to talk about. Not metaphorically, not speculation, but measured, documented, unstoppable. In just 6 weeks last year, 16 houses didn't gradually erode. They didn't weather a storm. They collapsed into the sea overnight in one town. In Rodanthe, North Carolina, a place that used to be a home for families. Summer rental salt-stained memories, the ocean is now taking 5 houses a year on average. 5. Families wake up to find the ground doesn't exist anymore. The house is gone. The foundation is gone. All that's left is the sound of gulls and the smell of disaster. And Rodanthe is just one pinpoint on a coastline that is literally being erased. We're not talking about a few at-risk properties or environmental concern that might matter in 50 years. We're talking about a state where more than 750 homes are now in the active zone of collapse. Nags Head Duck Avon towns that define the Outer Banks' identity are staring down an existential countdown that accelerates every single year. The North Carolina coast is losing 10, sometimes 15 feet per year. Per year. That's not a millimeter of seismic shift or a gradual rise. It's like watching a mile of your country's coastline vanish every 63 days, every single year. This is what happens when an ocean decides to take back what was never really ours in the first place. And this is the story they haven't fully told you yet. The Outer Banks are a thin chain of barrier islands stretching along the North Carolina coast. But barrier islands are not fixed land. They are moving sand. These islands naturally migrate inland as waves, tides, storms, and rising seas reshape them over time. The problem is simple humans built permanent homes, roads, and businesses on geography designed to move. The islands are not suddenly failing. They are behaving exactly the way barrier islands always have. The difference is that now millions of dollars of infrastructure sit directly in the path of that movement. Cape Hatteras National Seashore, 70 miles of protected beach accessible from the mainland only by Highway 12. A road that should not exist because the geology beneath it is constantly liquefying. The sand beneath those asphalt lanes is surrendering. Islands that were solid for centuries are now betraying the infrastructure built on top of them, flooding multiple times a year on normal high tides. Not storm surge, not hurricanes, just the regular ocean showing up a little bit higher than it used to. In 2024, high tide flooding was recorded on days when there was no storm, no wind, no emergency. Just water covering the roads because the baseline ocean level has risen enough to make normal tides extraordinary. Coastal retreat along the Outer Banks is not new, but in several locations, erosion rates began accelerating in the mid-2000s. Scientists point to a combination of rising sea level stronger wave energy warming ocean temperatures and changes in the Gulf Stream. The exact contribution of each factor remains debated. What is less debated is the trendline shoreline retreat became faster, more expensive, and harder to manage. Homes once considered safely inland started entering active erosion zones, while roads that had lasted for decades began requiring repeated emergency repairs. If the Outer Banks are the problem, Rodanthe is ground zero. It's a village of maybe 1,200 people on Hatteras Island squeezed between the Atlantic Ocean on one side and Pamlico Sound on the other. No escape route, no backup plan. Just water on both sides, and the land between them is shrinking faster than any community on the East Coast. In 2022, 2 houses collapsed on Ocean Drive during a nor'easter. Then another. Then another. By 2023, the State Department of Environmental Quality documented erosion happening at 12 to 15 feet per year on Seagull Street. That's not a number. That's a sentence. 12 to 15 feet. Imagine standing in your living room knowing that next year your living room will be 12 feet further inland, meaning the ocean edge where your porch used to be is now your master bedroom. The cascade accelerated into 2024. 6 houses collapsed that year. 6 distinct structures. 6 families displaced. 6 properties that went from having a market value to having 0 market value because nobody buys a house that's going to be swallowed within the decade. Between 2022 and 2024, 11 houses in Rodanthe entered the sea. The newest collapses are the most haunting. They don't fall slowly. They don't give warning. One family described waking to find their neighbor's house simply gone, vanished. The foundation undermined by sand loss below the water table. The structure held only by gravity and gravity lost. In one case, 3 houses collapsed within a single week. The ocean wasn't just rising. It was hungry. These aren't abandoned properties. These aren't condemned structures. When houses started falling in 2022, people were still trying to live in them. Families had to evacuate in the middle of the night. Tourists showed up for vacation rentals that were no longer accessible because the road had collapsed, or the house had collapsed, or both had collapsed simultaneously. What was a summer destination became a danger zone. In 2022, North Carolina spent $145 million relocating a 2.4-mile section of Highway 12 onto an elevated bridge over Pamlico Sound because the original route was no longer considered stable enough to defend. Officials hoped the bridge would buy time. But the larger problem remained. The island was eroding from both directions at once. Ocean waves stripped sand from the front, while rising water in Pamlico Sound pushed from behind, squeezing the barrier island from both sides. The state possesses the largest estuarine system on the Atlantic coast. The Pamlico Sound is one of the most productive ecosystems in North America, but it's also now a barometer for sea level rise. When the ocean gets higher, the sound gets higher. When the sound gets higher, the barrier islands, the only thing separating the sound from the open Atlantic, start disappearing. These sounds are critical for commercial fishing. They're nurseries for fish species that feed the entire mid-Atlantic. They're buffer systems that have protected coastal communities for centuries. How long can a community survive when its tax base, its roads, and its homes are all eroding at the same time? Sea level rise here is being driven by warming oceans and melting land ice, But North Carolina faces an additional problem. Changes in the Gulf Stream may be causing water to pile up along the coast, accelerating local sea level rise faster than many parts of the East Coast. And here's the scale reframe that makes this real. More than 750 homes along North Carolina's entire coast are now considered threatened with collapse or abandonment. 750. That's not a climate projection. That's not a might happen number. Those homes have already been identified by government agencies as being in active danger zones. In Dare County alone, where Rodanthe, Nags Head Duck, and Avon are located, communities are spending millions annually on beach nourishment projects. They pump sand onto the beaches every 5 years, temporary relief. Every 5 years, they have to do it again. Each cycle, the cost increases. Tens of millions of dollars per year. Each cycle, the sand washes away faster, requiring more sand the next time, demanding bigger budgets, pushing local governments toward inevitable financial collapse. North Carolina's government has spent billions of dollars trying to fight this problem. Beach nourishment programs. Coastal protection structures, elevated highways, emergency response after every storm. The state has thrown resources at erosion like few states have, and it's failing. Not because the effort isn't sincere, not because the engineering isn't sound, but because you cannot engineer your way out of a geography that is actively ceasing to exist. Dare County alone spends tens of millions of dollars per year on beach nourishment. The entire state's budget is strained by coastal protection, and every dollar spent is a temporary measure. Every project is a reprieve, not a solution. The fundamental problem is unsolvable with current technology and current budgets. You cannot stop the ocean from rising. You cannot prevent barrier islands from migrating inland. You cannot protect a civilization that is built on ground nature, designed to be temporary. The North Carolina Science Panel has published projections. By 2050, sea level will have risen at least 1 foot, possibly 2 feet. The difference between 1 foot and 2 feet is not the difference between an inconvenient problem and a serious problem. It's the difference between civilization and collapse. By 2050, state projections estimate sea level could rise between 1 and 2 feet. Combined with erosion and stronger storms, large sections of the Outer Banks may face chronic flooding and fragmentation. The timeline is not set in stone. It's probably faster than we want to admit. If current trends hold by 2035, a single powerful nor'easter could collapse another dozen homes in Rodanthe and cut the bridge approaches with overwash for weeks. Or if ice melt accelerates, as some models now suggest, sea level could hit the upper end of projections by 2045, making high tide flooding a weekly event across the Outer Banks and forcing the state to abandon Highway 12 entirely for long stretches. Coastal researchers at universities across the East Coast are still debating the exact contribution of local subsidence versus global sea level rise in these numbers. Some data suggests the acceleration since 2015 could include a component from natural variability in the Gulf Stream. What remains certain is the trend line pointing upward and the gap between current interventions and the rate of change. North Carolina's 500-mile coastline is not facing an apocalypse. It's facing something more complicated and more terrifying. A slow-motion transformation into a geography that no longer supports human civilization at the scale we've built it. This isn't about saving the Outer Banks. That battle was lost a decade ago when the erosion rate started exceeding the ability of any public fund to manage them. This is about managed retreat planning for evacuation. Deciding what gets abandoned, deciding what gets saved, deciding what communities will exist in 30 years, and which ones will be memories. The people in Rodanthe already know this. They're living it. 6 houses gone. 11 homes lost since 2022. Families deciding whether to rebuild knowing full well the ocean is going to take it again. Some families have decided to leave, sell what they can, take the loss, move to higher ground. But others are stubborn. They're fighting building seawalls, elevating foundations, trying to engineer their way out of a problem that can't be engineered away. The government isn't saving Rodanthe. It's managing Rodanthe's death. And the people left behind are negotiating the terms of surrender. If the barrier islands fragment within our lifetime, what happens to the fishing industry, the tourism economy, the families who have called this place home for generations? The question that haunts this entire region is unresolved and growing louder every year. If Rodanthe is dying, if Nag's Head is losing ground at 6 feet per year, if the barrier islands are fragmenting, what does the Outer Banks look like in 30 years? What does it look like in 50? The answers aren't coming from the government. They're not coming from the engineering firms building bridges and pumping sand. The only truth that emerges from the data is this: the Atlantic Ocean is taking back the North Carolina coast. Not in some distant future, now measured, documented, and completely unstoppable. The ocean doesn't pause for budgets or elections. It keeps rising, keeps eroding, keeps claiming what we built on shifting sand. Rodanthe showed us what happens when the math breaks. The same forces are at work up and down the coast. The clock isn't ticking. It's already struck. And the water is still coming.